panel is called Erosion of Democratic Institutions, Trends and Mitigation Strategies. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists right away. We have Anikó Bakonyi in the center, Director of the Refugee Program at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee in Hungary. To my right is Alex Scrivener, Executive Director at the Democratic Security Institute in Tbilisi, Georgia. And last but not least, Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć, Vice President of the Citizens Network Watchdog in Poland. Well, before giving the floor to the panelists, as a few words of introduction from myself. Well, as you saw in the previous, in the keynote address, backsliding in democracy at the global and particularly European level has been recorded for more than a decade. However, this decline has been particularly pronounced in the last few years, with the rise and sometimes coming to power of populistic anti-democratic forces and a dramatic drop of public support to traditional parties in the center of political spectrum. The public in the West and East, North and South, turned out to be disappointed in the idea of democracy and has become susceptible to populist appeals. The increasing polarization of societies, again, something addressed in the keynote speech, is really striking in many countries. To the surprise of many of us, it turns out that democratic institutions and democratic culture are very fragile and can be rather easily eroded or even dismantled. They are often used or manipulated by anti-democratic forces to their advantage, and if and when they come to power, they capture democratic institutions and try to gradually dismantle them to stay in power indefinitely. These negative developments are particularly worrying on the background of the large-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine and its active use, Russia's use, of hybrid aggression tools across the continent, including massive propaganda and disinformation. When a united voice of Europe and broader international community, voice and action are needed the most to stop the Russian aggression, support Ukraine, and ensure security across the continent, Europe is often divided, acts slowly and not strongly enough. As aggressive actions of the Putin regime, by the Putin regime and its allies are aimed precisely at destroying the democratic project, not only occupying Ukraine and reject or erasing the state of Ukraine from the map, but really dismantling or destroying the democratic project globally. The struggle in this war, I would claim, is not only for sovereignty of Ukraine, freedom of Ukrainian people, and security of the entire continent, but for the future of democracy itself. Importantly, resistance to the aggression and defeating the aggressor should not come at the price of abandoning democratic values and weakening of democratic institutions. Too often, democracy is sidelined in the name of security. Today, it is clear more than ever that democracy needs protection at all levels, from local to supranational. Civil society could be, and often has been, a key actor in the efforts to defend democracy, reverse the backlash, and rebuild democratic institutions. We need to make these institutions and democratic processes more robust, immune to autocratic capture, and able to regain public support by addressing key challenges that our societies face. They should become closer to the people, so to speak, and address a whole host of issues from economic to social concerns, to social exclusion of different groups, to problems in security, the environment, and much more. Finally, by playing a more active role in protecting and rebuilding democracy, civil society may also see benefits for itself, become more independent, again, as something discussed in the keynote address, regain its own agency, develop stronger links with the public, and build new alliances. Our panel is aimed at to draw on case studies from 3 countries that have had serious challenges to democratic institutions and processes and rule of law. And I would say at different stages of the development of the situation. These are Hungary, Georgia, and Poland. And we will have already damaged democratic institutions, as in Hungary, to those in the process of erosion, as in Georgia, and more hopeful situation, maybe. We'll hear more about that, where attempts at restoration of institutions are being made, as in Poland. And we will particularly look at the role of civil society in mitigating these challenges to democracy, and look at different institutions that have been a target of authoritarian revenge or pressure, such as media or the judiciary, and stifling of fundamental freedoms of expression, assembly, association, which are vital for democracy. And of course, the impact of the rising populistic forces and the influence of disinformation and propaganda, both inside and from the outside. We'll start with Anikó Bakonyi from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. As a matter of brief introduction, in her own words on the website, Anikó's interests have always centered around social justice, protecting and empowering disadvantaged groups in the society. In her professional life, Anikó has worked with victims of human trafficking, Roma, and Jewish survivors of Holocaust and their families, and refugees arriving in Hungary from all over the world. Since 2010, Anikó has been working for the Refugee Program of the Helsinki Committee, focusing on protecting the rights of refugees through human rights monitoring, counseling, advocacy, and reporting. Without further ado, I invite you, Anikó, to say a few words about the Hungarian situation. In particular, I would suggest that you tell us, if you may, how has civil society in Hungary responded to the transformation of an opposition party, allegedly democratic, to an authoritarian force ruling the country for quite a while, and what were the key moments when NGOs recognized the erosion of democratic institutions, and based on your experience at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, what lessons can civil society organizations in other countries learn from Hungary's struggle? Please.
Yes. Does it work now? Okay. So thank you very much for inviting. I think Hungary is always a very popular subject, unfortunately, when it comes to democratic decline. And we hope that at least this is an example that others can learn from. So the first question, yeah, that's very interesting to look back, like how we respond. I think in hindsight, very slowly, I would say, because it's basically a process where, you know, one day you are still a partner, you have a dialogue with the authorities, you have cooperation agreements, you work together, you share the work with them, and then there is this long process whereby at the end of which you're becoming an enemy. But of course, while you are in this process, it's hard to recognize that this will be the end result. And then many times, if I think back to that period that basically started in, let's say, 2014, 15, we were asking ourselves, you know, what happens, whether this is a bug in the system or that's a feature. Now we know it's a feature. But then we were always looking for excuses why something is happening, why we are not consulted, why we are not asked. And then we always had this very benevolent interpretation of events, which was, in hindsight, less justified than, you know, then. So basically, I think we responded kind of slowly, but then at some point, the message arrived that this was a very different regime than what it used to be. So what were the key moments of this mental journey? First of all, I think in 2017, when the Hungarian Helsinki Committee used to have cooperation agreements with the prison authority, with the asylum authority, and with the police. And within the framework of these cooperation agreements, we were able to do human rights monitoring of closed facilities, detention facilities, and also refugee camps, which is really important for a human rights watchdog organization. And then, you know, one day after the other, these cooperation agreements were canceled. I think that was a clear wake-up call. I still remember the days when one after the other, they were canceled by email. Actually, one day we were monitoring one detention facility, and by the time we arrived back in the office, there was the email that we no longer need to write the report on that particular visit because there is no longer a cooperation agreement within which this would be needed. So I think this was a very important moment. And then, of course, this was followed by very clear signs of anti-NGO legislation, stigmatizing, stifling, all these communication campaigns against civil society organizations, also media as well. But I know more intimately what happened to civil society, so I will concentrate on that. But I just want to say that the communication campaigns, they do not only aim at civil society, but all the voices which are dissenting, which are pro-democratic voices. So I'm just gonna do like one example of the smear campaign, which I think was, which gave us a lot of visibility. We weren't looking for so much visibility, but here you go. So we were trying to test our name recognition before 2018. I think after 2018, it probably grew because the government decided to send, there were these national consultations, a very popular move by the Fidesz government, that they kind of ask people about certain issues which are central to their politics. And this was their idea. The first one is that they connected terrorism and migration in one of these national consultations. And then, of course, you never know the real answer to these consultations because you can also fill it in online and then probably the results are pretty much rigged. But this is something that happened from time to time. And in 2018, 8 million households received a question where our name was also in one of the questions, and then our activities were quite much misrepresented that we later won at court. But at that time, everybody could read about how we serve foreign interest and how what exactly we do in the eyes of the government. So I think that was just one example of how smear campaign was carried out. So there were legislative, and there are still legislative acts aimed at trying to restrict civil society activity. The first one was in 2017. It's this foreign-funded NGO act that's very popular, unfortunately, in our region, following pretty much the Russian recipe. You had to register if you had above 28,000 euros in your income from foreign sources. So any NGO who wants to survive in Hungary has that kind of resource. So we decided not to register for this. And I have to say that we only had one donor who left us because of us not keeping the rules, the current rules then in Hungary. This was followed by the infamous Stop Source legislation in 2018. That is basically criminalizing assistance to asylum seekers. There was a 1-year prison sentence that was never levied, but it was still there. And then there is another piece of legislative act, 25% tax for immigration supporting related activities. This legislation is still in place, have never been used, but also this helped some of the programs aiming at refugees to decide for closure because they were afraid that they would be concerned by this. And finally, last but not least, last year saw the opening of the Sovereignty Office, the sovereignty as the government sees, but it is basically there to control media and civil society. So, as we've heard in the opening speech, Hungary is an electoral autocracy with all its characteristics. So what are the lessons so far? I mean, we are still learning, I have to say. So this will be an open-ended list, but I will just list a few things. So first of all, I think when this process starts, I think organizations need to decide how long they are willing to cooperate with the authorities in an increasingly hostile environment. How long you are willing to be the fig leaf in a consultation or in a state coordinated body, how long you are willing to give your name to it. Also, once there is like this alternative government-created civil society in your country, what your relationship to these actors are. Another dilemma, I think, and that has to be decided by organizations, is whether you think that if you stay under the radar and then you continue silently, then you'll be let do whatever you do, or you decide to give publicity, visibility to your activities, which does protect you, but it also makes you a target. I think another lesson is that it's good to discuss all this internally as soon as possible, so to have a buy-in from your colleagues so that they would know what they are into. So for example, whenever we are hiring now at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, we already say this at the job interview, that, you know, if you're, let's say, at the beginning of your career, and if you're going to work for us, then you need to consider that you may never be employed by any state body in Hungary. So you should take on the job knowing this. And we also learned that we can continue doing, we just need to be very creative and we need to do things differently, but we can continue with all our activities. And also, what's really important is that we are not alone in this. So there are other actors who can help you, who you can learn from. We also had this sharing of experiences with some people in the room who were helping us when this all started. And I think that's a very important resource that we shouldn't forget. And last but not least, you know, when there are international actors, let's say if your country is an EU member or, you know, Council of Europe member, then it's also very important to urge these actors to look at this in a holistic way, not just by legislation, because if you are attacking every piece of legislation, then you might be losing the big picture that, you know, that these autocrats are aiming for. Thanks.
Thank you, Anikó. I'm sure that's just the tip of an iceberg, and we will have questions, I'm sure, from the audience, and a lot to discuss. Now, moving to a different region and somewhat different political reality, but very much in the focus of attention by the democracy watchers and supporters, South Caucasus, Georgia, moving to Alex Scrivener. As I said, Alex is the executive director of Democratic Security Institute in Georgia, a founding member of the organization, based in Tbilisi. And Alex is responsible for management and organizational strategy. Alex is a long-time analyst of the region with a special focus on the Caucasus and has worked for a variety of international civil society and media organizations in Europe and the region, including the BBC, the International Criminal Court, Global Justice Now, and the Transnational Institute, and has had his articles published in a variety of media, including The Guardian, The Independent, and Open Democracy. Alex, many of us who follow the situation in Georgia say that a democratic future is now on the brink in this country. Could you please tell us what are the possible outcomes of the upcoming parliamentary elections? What are the best and worst case scenarios and their impact on democracy? How will these outcomes influence public institutions? And what are the main steps on the road of erosion of institutions in Georgia, or should we say dismantling them? that people in other countries could pay attention to and also learn lessons. And what is civil society doing to oppose the erosion of democratic institutions and the rule of law? And what is a particular foreign influence, not in the terminology of the autocrats, but the real malign or hostile foreign influence aimed at supporting the dismantling of democracy in your country? Please.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a lot of questions, so I'm not sure I'll be able to answer quite all of them comprehensively in my short talk. But I'd like to start by thanking you for inviting me and saying how much of an honor it is to be here amongst fellow agents of George Soros, fellow destroyers of patriotism, fellow destroyers of family traditional values, and fellow people who want to start wars and destroy everything that traditional patriotic governments want to do, and like obviously bring lots of migrants in as well to destroy our culture, all of that great stuff. So it's really nice to be among friends. But I start with that, but actually the fact that all of you were sort of laughing at that suggests that actually we are fighting a very similar battle. Like these sort of messages are messages we hear not just in Georgia, but also in Hungary and across the region, in Russia and everywhere else. And, I think it's indicative of the fact that the authoritarians in our region have a particular toolbox, a particular set of messages, a particular set of tools. And in that toolbox, civil society, as in us, we are enemy number one. And Georgia is absolutely no exception here. But the question is, how did we get here in Georgia? Because on the face of it, Georgia is not a very good candidate for this kind of messaging. Polls suggest that between 80 and 90% of people in Georgia want EU membership. Huge support for Ukraine in Georgia amongst civil society, overwhelming support. Obviously, in 2008, we fought a war with Russia, so Russia is not particularly popular, having colonized us for about 200 years. So these are not, these are not sort of bases, you'd think, for the sort of successful Putinist propaganda in our country. How then have we ended up with an authoritarian, I would say collaborationist government? I say collaborationist rather than pro-Russian, because even the government in Georgia, because of that 80 to 90% support for Europe, cannot openly say that they are supporting the Putin regime, even if what they do often is supportive of their narratives. So why are we in Georgia now having what feels like our Yanukovych moment at the worst possible time? And with these elections on the 26th of October, which is in about 10 days' time, it all comes to a crux. So to give you some kind of context about Georgia and the political situation for those of you who may not be following quite as closely. So Georgian Dream, who are the main party of power, came to power in 2012. They're kind of led by this sort of oligarch, I guess, called Bidzina Ivanishvili. But back in 2012, the coalition that came to power was, includes many liberals, many pro-democracy forces. It was actually seen as a step forward for democracy, not a step backwards. In 2020, which is the last election, which they won 48% of the vote then, they were led by Prime Minister Georgi Gaharea, who is now one of the leaders of the opposition parties. He was elected on a manifesto of joining the EU and achieving EU candidate status, which they did do last year. We now have EU candidate status. But the thing is that there was a huge change. So when people ask, why did you elect such a crazy government? Well, the answer is we didn't. In 2020, completely different people were in charge of the same political party, and it was a very, very different manifesto in which they were elected. But since the Ukraine invasion, something changed very, very sharply in Georgia, and there was a sharp shift towards authoritarianism. The government, and I suppose when I say the government, I mean Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is the person who has most power in Georgia, realized that in a democracy, you cannot stay in power forever. He's coming up to 12 years now, since 2012, and he realizes, wait a minute, I didn't have any problem with the West before, but now, actually, I'm realizing I'm losing popularity, and I want to stay in power forever, and the West won't let me do that. So I guess, what am I going to do? And it's shifted this very big shift towards authoritarianism. And he made best friends with Viktor Orban. Every week, every 2 weeks, it feels, there is a visit from Péter Szijjártó to Tbilisi, or Georgian foreign minister to Hungary, or even Orban came and visited himself and graced us with his wonderful presence not too long ago. I think the Georgian Prime Minister keeps going to these conservative political action conferences in Budapest, where they are all sort of standing together against the scourge of civil society. So suddenly, Georgian Dream, which is a party that was formerly a member of the Party of European Socialists in 2020, became part of this far-right Orbanist collective. And this came to a head in earlier this year, when they passed the same anti-NGO Russian-style law, which led to huge protests. I think maybe a fifth of the country were out in the streets. The entire youth, but also not just the youth, were out. It was one of the biggest protests in Georgian history. Despite that, the law was passed anyway. And now we're in a situation where on October the 26th, we see an election where democracy itself is on the ballot. If the government wins, we are going down the path, at least of Orban, maybe worse. And the opposition is divided and not in a great situation. But it is existential. So how do we get here? So the campaign of Georgian Dream is sort of based on 5 pillars. And I think those are the same pillars that I started this talk with. The co-optation of peace narratives. So peace being, war being the thing. If we stand up to Russia, if we stand up for democracy, we are standing up for war. We are against peace somehow. Secondly, the weaponizing of Western's reluctance to act. So Ukraine is not being supported properly by the West. If Russia comes in, they will do nothing, so we have to do what we have to do. Traditional values, and especially homophobia. Anti-NGO rhetoric like the Russian law. And the use of administrative resources and the misuse of the civil service institutions to pursue government party political objectives. So that's, I think, the basis of their campaign. But it's not as easy as that for them. Because the reality of Georgia, those sort of base realities of being overwhelmingly pro-European country, overwhelmingly anti-Putin country, and overwhelmingly supportive for Ukraine, still works against them. And this means the reality that even Georgian Dream can't be openly anti-European. So what happens next? What are the possible ways forward after this election on the 26th? Well, it looks like plan A, as I've said before, is for the government to follow the Orban playbook. That's why they are visiting each other like old lovers every week, because they are constantly learning from the Orban government how to mess with people's minds effectively, use manipulation, misinformation, cast civil society as the enemy. All of these, even some of the posters actually are the same. I recognize in Tbilisi there was these posters, all the opposition leaders on these leashes being controlled by Soros, basically. And that's exactly the same theme I remember in the Hungarian elections last time, with all the Hungarian opposition leaders depicted in a very similar way. I think with migration, I think was the issue there. But basically, very, very similar. I can, as someone who have family connections to Hungary as well, I've seen both situations, and I can see there's a lot. You can see that they've just copied and pasted the same tactics from Hungary. So that is what they want to do. The best case scenario is that somehow we have a Poland scenario. We are in a situation where, similar to Poland, the opposition is divided into a few blocks. In Poland, there are 3. Unfortunately, in Georgia, there are 4, which makes it more difficult. And the opposition hates each other for a much greater extent than the Polish opposition even did. But yeah, the best case scenario is that somehow at this election, the opposition, which I think if the elections are held fairly, this will happen. That's a big if. Because the opinion polls suggest that the Georgian Dream will not be able to get a majority. This is where the difference is between Poland and Hungary. The difference with Hungary is Hungary had a very bad electoral system, which basically is very biased towards you have basically first past the post, you have constituencies. We got rid of that in Georgia, so actually you have a proportional system, which means that Georgian Dream have to win at least sort of 45, 46% of the vote to win. And all of the opposition looks like they will get, according to opinion polls, more than enough to get rid of them. In theory. But the other difference is that we still have some free institutions. So we have a lot of pro-opposition media, pro-opposition TV channels. We don't quite have a situation like in Hungary where the Central European University was kicked out, but we have the beginnings of the same process. So the main, more liberal university, I guess, in Tbilisi, the Ilia University, had some of their accreditation put into question, but we're still not so far down the road as in Hungary, so we still have media, some sort of very Georgian model of authoritarianism, but freedom of speech at the same time. Judiciary is a complete, is a mess. Unfortunately, the judiciary is a slave to the government, effectively. The Constitutional Court was supposed to, there was an appeal against the Russian law, and the Constitutional Court has refused to freeze the law. And because it's in the Georgian constitution that Georgia must pursue EU membership, it's a constitutional principle of Georgia that we must have European integration, so it's a real no-brainer for the Constitutional Court to find against a law that would disqualify us from EU membership, but that's not happened because the judiciary is completely enslaved to a much worse extent than was ever the case, I think, even in Poland. Judiciary has always been a weak point in Georgian democracy. So, yeah, we have this situation. Yeah, we have some institutions, we have media, we have freedom of speech to some extent, but that looks like it might all be disappearing. Obviously, the civil society situation. We have the Russian law. My organization, we've had to re-register in Estonia to try and escape the obligation to register under this foreign agents bill. We refused, and I think the whole of Georgian civil society has refused to comply with this. And yeah, unfortunately, unlike in Poland, the Georgian opposition is terrible. You know, I mean, I'm sure you'll disagree and tell me that the Polish opposition was then not optimal either. But compared to the Georgian opposition, I'd say I would take the Civic Platform and Lewo Razem and all that lot in 1 second over the people we have to deal with in Georgia, because basically the biggest opposition party was in government before 2012, has its own authoritarian history of repression, which people do not like. And of the other opposition parties, they hate each other so much for various personal and political reasons that they are always squabbling, and it's very hard to believe that the government made up of these 4 opposition parties will last very long at all. And it's very, very a big weak point. Even if the opposition win, it could not end particularly well. But they have to win, otherwise we are in a very bad situation. And the worst case scenario, of course, is we have, and I think maybe not an unlikely one, is that the Georgian government just resorts to outright oppression. And we don't go just down the Orban route, but we go down the Lukashenko, Tokayev route of basically Russian either soft or hard power being brought to bear to impose a situation on Georgia where the government is kind of remaining in power despite the will of the people. Now, I don't say it's the most likely option, but I think it is very possible. We have Russian tanks stationed a few kilometers from our capital. It would not take much, even if with the Russian army very, very obviously busy at the moment elsewhere. Georgia's a very small country. It would not take much for them to do a symbolic move to terrify people into basically falling into line. So it could, we could have a situation where we have outright repression. I don't think it's the most likely, because Georgia is a country where still the expectation of freedom and democracy is much higher than, let's say, Belarus. So it's much more difficult to repress an active and big civil society than one that's been repressed for a long time. But it is a fear that we all have, that that's the worst case scenario. So I guess the options, back to your first question, is we could be Poland in the best case scenario, we could be Belarus in the worst case scenario, or we could be Orban's Hungary in the kind of still pretty bad scenario. So I'm kind of praying to all the gods that we are allowed to be Poland after the 26th of October. And I think I would not be surprised if you asked me which of those do I expect to happen. I would say whatever happens, even if we get the Poland scenario, I think this government will do anything to not lose power, because they have basically committed criminal acts of not just treason against the country, but also a lot of financial crimes. I think they know if they lose power, they may go to jail. And they will do anything to hold on to power, because they would rather be in power than anything else. And if they lose power, they don't just go and be nice in opposition. They might have to have criminal responsibility. So I think they will do anything. They will resort to the judiciary, the courts, just outright ballot fraud, perhaps, if things get very bad, to maintain power. So even if the opposition win, they will try everything, maybe buy off individual members of parliament from the opposition. I don't think anything is beyond them. So I think whatever happens after 26th of October, you will see Georgia in the news in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And my final comment, I think, because I think I've gone on for too long, is to ask for your solidarity as my fellow evil agents of George Soros. And especially, I think we have quite a large now Russian community in Georgia, because a lot of people have run away from the military mobilization. And one of the sad facts there is the Russian community kind of lives a very parallel, separate life from normal Georgian political life. So I saw when Navalny was killed by the Russian authorities, there was a big protest from local Russians. And there were maybe a few Georgians there, but it was mostly Russians. And when we were having our battles against our government, which is part of the same octopus of evil, we saw very few Russians from the Russian community. And I think if any of you in the kind of Russian activist space, some of you are here, have any friends in Tbilisi in exile, please ask them to help support our Georgian struggle for freedom, because I think ultimately it will be the same struggle and the same fight against the same enemy. So I think I'll end there. And yeah, thank you very much.
We certainly will be watching and supporting as much as possible, but maybe I will leave it to the question, answer, comments part of our panel. We need to understand better how can people support, other than joining the rallies, which may be not enough, really, as we have seen in the past. Well, zooming back to Central Europe, the case of Poland will be presented by Katarzyna Batko-Tołuć. Again, as a brief introduction, Katarzyna is Vice President of Watchdog, Poland Civic Network. Importantly, through litigation, advocacy, and building grassroots movements, the organization aims at enforcing freedom of information, transparency of governments, and accountability in decision-making, working with more than 1,000 activists, bloggers, journalists, and organizations and groups across the country. Importantly, civic engagement at the local level is sort of the main focus of activities, transforming or attempting to transform the relationship between citizens and local governments by facilitating dialogue between them and promoting shared benefits of this new relationship. And Katarzyna has been working for more than, I don't know, 12, maybe years, 15? 20? Okay. It's been like one day, yes. In shaping this, well, should we say, political consciousness of citizens, trying to make them or help them becoming agents of democracy, if you wish. Katarzyna, a situation with democratic institutions and the rule of law in Poland was a matter of very serious concern for a long time under the previous government. But with a change of government about a year ago, less than a year ago, there is or has been a glimpse of hope for change. However, things are not easy. I dare to say that strong citizen control over the government and civil society's consistent efforts to push for reforms are essential for sustainable change. Damage done was very serious, and we want to hear from you, to learn from you, what challenges arise in the process of rebuilding broken institutions. Are there any delayed effects of the long period of dismantling and erosion, including at the level of society, not only institutions themselves? And how this process can be accelerated and changes made irreversible, if I may say? And what is the state of political culture in Poland now? These are all issues that are of great interest to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I feel that I need to refer somehow to Hungary and Georgia, just because a few things were mentioned, and I see, first of all, I would like to appreciate learning that I had from the forum. And it's not just because I'm polite, because of course I am, but I'm here, like Yuri, from 2011. And so I could observe what happened in the Russian community and then Hungarian. And for Polish organization, this was a really important lesson learned. So I remember the first attack on civil society, And there was this idea, we need to be solidar. We need to kind of, because what they are going to do, they are going to divide us. They are going to say, there was no talking about the foreign agents law at that moment, but there, of course we could expect it sooner or later. But we knew that from discussions that we had here in the forum, and I remember the discussion in The Hague, when there were huge divisions visible in Russian civil society, because some of the organizations were already foreign agents, others somehow hoped they are not going to be. So the first thing that we did was solidar action and campaign what NGOs are doing. We even changed the name NGOs because it sounds strange in Polish, and we started to use civic organizations or social organizations. That was like even changing vocabulary, saying stories, which I wouldn't say had huge impact on the society, but it was like slow introduction of some way of thinking. Also, we very much politicized, and this was already in the slides that we had before, that civil society started to be very political. So I wouldn't say we won elections, but we feel like that we won elections, which of course is bias. Before 2015, when all changes in Poland started, we would never say, and for me, that is for someone from the organization working, first of all, with the local level, but not only. We work also, because we work with freedom of information. Freedom of information is everywhere. The quality of public debate, disinformation, propaganda, language that is used. This is, of course, something that is on the local and on the central level. But we were very careful about our language. We were very careful about not being tied to any of the political forces. Somehow it changed over those years. The third thing was that we were, in the moment, in 2015, because of the public money, huge public money, supporting NGOs, Polish civil society sector was mostly dependent on public money, which meant there was no watchdog organization. The language of controlling, overseeing the government, or protecting rights, or minorities' rights. This was the language that was absent from the public debate. Now, everybody says, we control every power, we protect citizens' rights. So over those 8 years, not everybody, okay, we still have charity organizations, but the number of initiatives that appeared during the 8 years, and the language changed very much. So I think that, and I even remember, Yuri, with you or with someone, but I think that it was like years ago, we had this discussion, with Harry Hummel. We had this discussion that maybe civil society should be more politicized. And I was, at that moment, I was like, so what? We should say that we support some party? It's not exactly that. We support values, but of course this is pretty visible who is for which values, so somehow we do that. And because those NGOs that were watchdog organizations or some more political, they knew they will have no money because international donors have already withdrawn from the region. Public money was not for us, so we knew that we have to develop something. Of course, we lobbied the European Union, but another idea was that we are going to raise money from citizens. And before 2015, no one believed that any money will go for migrants, for democracy. What a language, what democracy is. So these were unpopular topics. But we were working on constituency building. So we had this idea how we are going to ask citizens for support, what kind of language we are going to do, who is our constituency, to whom we are talking, what we target. And of course, this was very theoretical. People didn't believe it's going to happen, but it happened. In a moment when the government started to attack us, citizens got engaged because they already knew us, because we started to communicate with them a year earlier, not because we knew the government is going to change, but we knew we are not going to have money. And of course, it's not like that I'm saying about half of the civil society, but enough to give us some wind. And we also had a very supportive law. There is in Poland, and this is something that cannot be repeated without having this law in place. There is this 1% designation, like each citizen, each taxpayer can pay 1% of their tax to an NGO that has public benefit status. And for years, of course, watchdog organizations, democratic organizations never get significant money. Those money went for charities. And suddenly this mechanism worked very well. And it was difficult for the government to change the law because they would have to say directly, this organization can get it and this can't. So somehow there were some things in place that helped us. I know I will answer this question at some point. So, but I think that these were important things that happened in Poland. And of course the new government in 2015 started from changes. Changes were like, probably the most important that made them, that caused impunity, at least they thought it's going to cause impunity, was connecting prosecutor office with the Minister of Justice. Minister of Justice is the biggest evil in Polish rule of law times, crisis times. So you could even find the breach of the law, but then if you go to the prosecutor, then nothing is going to happen. Then they attacked, it's not in chronological order, but at some point they attacked court system and they closed the system. So they closed it in a way that even if there is a law that is somehow useful for us, for civil society, they can change the law. The law will be signed by the president because president is from the same option. And because they changed it's pretty complicated, so I'm not going to talk about that, but because the government overtook the Constitutional Tribunal, so even if the law is directed to Constitutional Tribunal, of course we know what Constitutional Tribunal is going to do. So there was one case with elections in 2020 when civil society used the criminal law to make the authorities accountable because of some problems with elections, whatever. Prosecutor didn't want to take the case, but then we went to the court. Courts were still, there was a mixed situation, independent what type of judge you are going to have. So we won in a court, and the court said, your prosecutor has to start. Prosecutor said no. So then it went to the court. And there was an opportunity for us to be a prosecutor ourselves, because this was the procedure. And we won one case, but we had several like that. And what the government did, they changed the law. And because they changed the law, then they said, this is the abolition law. We are not going to make the authorities accountable for what they did in this particular case. So the system was completely closed. You couldn't do anything because you were like in the vicious circle. So they changed, of course, in judiciary. They started pressure on judges. So because judges were the only weak point, we have actually pretty good justice system. There are many failures that judges are not careful enough, that they are not attentive, they are arrogant, they like that, but they are not dependent. So what they wanted to do was to make them dependent. And they, like 1/4 of the judges was kind of, we have a problem with them, but we still had 75% of those who were not, like, somehow were not, I wouldn't say broken, because actually there was only a few of them who were openly opposing, but they didn't manage with the with the judiciary system to the end, but now it is a problem, and I will come back to it. They wanted, we were also saved by the fact that politicians of the rule, in the second term, Law and Justice had 2 terms. In the first time, they were very fast. In the second, there were divisions. And this is also about lesson learned. When Anikó said, you don't have to attack everything, so we had this foreign agent law proposed by one of the parties that were part of the United Rights, because they were named United Right. And we were silent about that, because we knew they are dreaming on having some public debate on that. Because then they could say, you are foreign agents. Isn't it right that foreign agents are named? We were silent. We didn't react. Well, there were some reactions, but thanks God, media didn't continue. And it died because it was the internal fight within the United Right, not something that really had any chance to go to the civil society, which is also about political tactics, which we learned during this time. So I would say that this politicization, solidarity, and using existing ways was very important. And where we are now, of course, they overtook also public media, tried to overtake private media. They abused state resources to the elections. They wanted to change electoral code, but because they were divided, they couldn't do that. And opposition, last thing about opposition helped us. Of course, they were divided, but a week or 2 weeks before the elections, they stopped doing that. And citizens who were mobilized by civil society was like probably the most important actor, because we united, we cooperated, we talked to different groups. It was not that we had one campaign, we had like 20-something campaigns mobilizing different groups. And opposition suddenly started to tell people what they expected. They will do something with abortion, they will do something with LGBT rights. This was symbolic. They will do something with the rule of law, which is actually a niche topic. So generally they were talking what people wanted to hear and what we organizations could kind of use in our campaigns, because go to elections because you need change or you whatever. But you know, there was a reason why to go to elections, which is not the case now. Next year we have presidential elections and everybody has a headache what we are going to tell citizens, why you should go to elections if most of the promises were not met. But we still have 7 months, so situation may change. And now you asked how difficult it is to go out. I know this was the main question.
Yeah, it's been 1 year. Yes.
Well, something that is left and which is systemic is the judiciary, the problem with the judiciary, because there is like systemic problem which is not dependent even on the president, on changing, on next elections. What to do with this 1/4 of judges? There is, on the one hand, there is expectation, 1/4 of judges who somehow underwent the wrong path, let's say. There shouldn't be like automatic punishment. There should be somehow verification, but the expectation is that there is going to be a punishment. Of course, we can do nothing with that because we know that president will not sign any law that reforms anything. So now there is a discussion, but also civil society is divided. So there are groups who say, no, we have to keep the international standards, and Venice Commission said what kind of standards it is, but there are judges and they have very strong associations and they say, no, it has to be faster, there should be accountability and punishment. So this is something that is left in the system. Public media, this is another problem. They were overtaken by the previous government. Now, this is also because of the president, but also because of an inactivity of the current government. Nothing really happens around public media. And the last thing, this is not meeting the symbolic expectations of the civil society, which is LGBT rights, anti-abortion law, free choice law, let's call it, and the topic of migration, because this is the biggest disappointment. This is the change of the language. New government uses the taxes, the language of security. This is probably a tactic before the next elections, but still, this is something that made us very active to protest against this government. So all in all, the situation, but there is a difference. When I hear that Georgia would like to follow Polish way, I prefer this way than the way how we felt for 8 years. How much there was about those values. Someone asked whether we have some document with values. In Poland, there was a new law on funding civil society, and in this new law, suddenly we had preamble, and in this preamble we had traditional patriotic values are the most important. So I would say we had such a document.
Under the previous government?
And still the law exists, but this is, it was openly said what we are going to do.
Whew. Thank you, Kasia. Difficult work ahead. You should also keep in mind that maybe not everyone follows closely that the president is from the opposing party, so to speak. That's why many of the reforms are even not being tried or legislative change, because he will never sign them.
True, but the expectation is that they will prepare laws, because now it seems as nothing happens.
And then there are divisions in the ruling coalition, which, you know, as Alex has said, and Kasia, are quite serious. Anyhow, amazing 3 cases. We are living through history now, not only in, you know, we're saying this every time when we listen to news from the battlefield in Ukraine or supporting Ukrainians in their struggle for all of us, but also when we look at these country situations, it is also, I have a very strong feeling that we are living through history now. It's not just, you know, a normal life that we maybe used to have 20, 30 years ago. Amazing. I have a set of 3 questions, of 3 themes, but I will now restrain myself and ask you for comments and questions. We have about 12 minutes, maybe 15 max, if we want to have lunch. So please be concise and clear. If there are not enough questions, I will take over with my. Is there? There is enough.
Или вы можете вот там вот оттуда нами руководить.
Over there, on the left, upside, upright, whatever. Up there, yes. Okay, I was sent here. Yeah, I'll prefer to be with you.
Работает. Я задам свой вопрос по-русски, поэтому возьмите наушники с переводом те, кому они нужны. Вопрос. Меня зовут Елена Шахова, я работаю в правозащитной организации «Гражданский контроль», которая находится в Санкт-Петербурге, в России. Вопрос такой. Я сама очень много размышляю о гражданском обществе, о праве на свободу ассоциации. И, конечно, я вижу все, что происходит. Считаете ли вы, что неправительственные организации должны продолжать вот это вот политизирование своей работы, превращаясь потом, я не знаю, создавая какие-то отдельные партии потом или как-то вообще взаимодействуя, в общем, очень тесно с политиками? Потому что для меня ответ на этот вопрос пока еще однозначно нет никогда. Самым лучшим примером, который у меня есть, чтобы продемонстрировать, почему этого нельзя сделать, это как раз польский пример. Потому что нынешний министр юстиции Польши, господин Адам Боднар, в прошлом работал в Хельсинском фонде по правам человека, в самой крупной организации правозащитной в Польше, был омбудсманом по правам человека в Польше, а сейчас он фактически не может сделать ничего, чего хотели бы сделать правозащитники, и за что сам он в свое время
став министром
долго...
юстиции, надо объяснить.
Да, став министром юстиции, за что он сам так долго боролся. Спасибо.
I suggest we collect a few questions to save time. Okay, let's take one over here, and then down, and then up.
Thank you.
Okay.
In Hungary, EU funding, or more precisely the way EU funding has been used, has greatly contributed to the dismantling of democracy. Have you experienced anything similar in Poland, Katarzyna?
Thank you for the 3 case studies. And you put it nicely in the beginning that Poland is getting out from something, Georgia is getting into something, and then we have something still ongoing. And what we still have ongoing is actually a model. It's urbanization or deurbanization in this sense. But now we can say that as well, yes. But especially in a Central European perspective. And now, for the past decade and a half, for the first time in Hungary, we can witness actual competition, a possibility in 2026 in the election. And my question would be, namely with Péter Magyar, and my question would be, because I haven't witnessed any comment on his side towards reaching out to civil society organizations or maybe cooperating, but maybe I'm missing something, and the question is whether you have witnessed if he has something to discontinue with these practices, or are we going to witness something which is actually a continuation? Thank you.
You mean Orban's practices, whether he...
Yes,
Yeah,
whether
okay.
there will be a disruption or
Okay.
is business as usual, only with a different person.
Okay. I think there was one up there, and then over there, and then here. And probably we'll complete.
Yeah.
our questions.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. And I have a question about Georgian experience, actually. We are watching very closely and hoping for the best scenario for you. But my question is, how high, in your opinion, is the possibility of the election being rigged? Because you've mentioned it somehow a little bit in your speech. And if they are, what are the possible ways to fight it, I guess? How do you see it? What can be done?
Up there, and then down here.
Hello, I'm Krzysztof Barczak from Helsinki Foundation for Human Rights from Poland. Actually, yes, our ex-president of our fund became the minister, but as soon as he entered to politics, we just have nothing to do with this area links with us. This is the rule. Okay, yeah, but as soon as we have this rule that as soon as they enter into politics, then we just cut off our links. Actually, we have nothing to do with them, but it's like this. But I would like to ask about the strategy which civil society should take to prepare for the transition from autocratic to democratic system. Like in Poland, our civil society took a very important role, actually played very important role to mobilize people. And I remember our ex-president speech during our training for Russian civil society in September.
Of the foundation, that is, not the country.
Yeah. And she told that in this modern time it's twice more difficult to talk to people because they are so divided. We have to adapt our language to explain the role of constitution, rights, and everything. It's twice more difficult. So I would like to ask you which strategy we should take, how to prepare for this transition, especially to reach out to people. That's why.
Thank you. Thank you. Krzysztof, and down here, please.
Thank you.
A couple of additions from me.
Talking about the erosion of the democratic institution, I'm seeing the link between it and the Foreign Agents Act. personally, I am a really optimistic person, but this makes me pessimistic for Bulgaria. A little bit context. Bulgaria now, the party that would be probably second in this 7th election for 3 years, is proposing foreign agents law, which is actually for 500 euros or more. So it wouldn't pass as in Poland, but the problem for me is that this is the narrative. This topic is a political narrative which is gaining votes. It's a long story for the connections between the KGB and the Bulgarian political society and so on. However, in the Russian translation, Puti Reshenia, in English it's more directly translated as the road of the resolving it. Do you see some road that could be making connections between the different countries? Because in Eastern Europe, we are seeing this problem, and this is actually what is Kremlin doing. Bulgaria several years ago was a main point for Euro integration of the Western Balkans. Now we are seeing this erosion in Macedonia, in Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of interesting questions. Good for a whole, yes please, additional panel. But let me add a couple from me. And then you choose. You know, of course you don't have to, and you cannot, each of you, answer to all of these. So please choose your battles, so to speak. My first is why anti-democratic populist forces are so successful in gaining public support. I'm not talking about institutions, rigging elections and all this, because clearly they have leverage, but why are people so accepted of populist slogans and policy? And that a bit resonates with Krzysztof's question, how do we work with the members of the public to address democratic processes, not just institutions? Secondly, it resonates with Yelena's question. I'm less skeptical about cooperation with political forces, but my question is, who are our allies? How can we, in this very difficult uphill struggle, engage with, influence, cooperate when possible with political forces, pro-democracy, not ideal, but that's what we have, and still remain independent, autonomous, not become politicized in the negative sense of the word, but be politicized in terms of impact on democratic processes. And finally, on the EU influence, and here I have some resonance with your question over there. Yes, criticism of the EU institutions and claims that they encroach on the sovereignty of states, bring together all the autocrats in the three country cases, so to speak. So my question is, has the use of different tools by the EU in respect of democratic erosion, including legal, policy, financial, been a failure or success, and what could be done differently? Because we need to look at the whole range of actors and instruments. So this has not been really mentioned too much or at all by you, really. So I wonder why. Thank you. Maybe in the same order, if you don't mind. Anikó, choose any.
Okay, so I think if you look at the questions that were raised, I think the question that Lena raised is really very important, because many of the questions actually center around NGOs being pushed into the political sphere. If you think of your questions, that is also, every time we are asked about something, I feel like I need to apologize that I'm not a political analyst. Because many of the questions actually do refer to that. And I think it's an important question where you put yourself as a civil society organization And then I do see that the way we answer this question is that we are becoming closer and closer to political parties, which I don't think is an ideal situation, because NGOs have their own role to play, and I think it's very important that we were able to play that role. I think cooperation can only be imagined still the way we answer this question. I think the way we answer the question, let's say 10 years ago, is that we didn't have any cooperation with any party because of the way we saw ourselves. I think the answer is now a little bit different because we make what you said, this value-based judgment on whom do we assist, let's say, with expert material. But I think this is how far it goes. So I think it's really important to preserve our identities as members of civil society. And in terms of the what you asked about Hungary, about this new political figure, I think this is also often comes up as a question. As I said, I'm not a political analyst. I'm a citizen when it comes to him. But he hasn't made any gestures to civil society. And to be honest, from this value-based point of view, I don't think he's very close to the values that, let's say, the Hungarian Helsinki Committee stands for. In terms of his approach to migration, he's very similar to the current government in Hungary. So I'm not very hopeful in that sense. And finally, I just want to comment on the EU question that you raised on EU institutions. I think the EU was initially, similarly, I would say what I said at the beginning, was not very well prepared for what was coming, because the EU was based on, willing members who were joined based on a common value system, and I think it wasn't prepared for governments like, the Hungarian government or what the Polish government used to do. So I think they also needed some time to wake up. And I think what we were missing for a very long time is a more holistic approach to all these infringements, which I think is now more there. So the EU has more now the toolbox of what's needed. But it's rather sad development, I would say, that this is what it takes for them, and this is what it has to deal with.
Thank you. Alex.
Okay, I'll have a go. So there was a lot of questions around politicisation of the civil society sector, and I think, yes, we don't have a choice. I think that's basically what you were saying as well. We haven't chosen to become politicised or party political supporters of particular political groups. It's been imposed upon us because when democracy itself is on the ballot, when one choice is autocracy and dictatorship and the other choice is, well, we can maintain some form of democracy, we as proponents of that democratic system have no choice but to become, to some extent, party political in that way. And I don't think there's much we can do about that in this horrible political moment that we live. But what we can do is when our side win, quote unquote, and we have democratic forces, relatively speaking, whether we agree with them in other ways or not, in power, that's when we show our integrity, because we can still be critical of those forces when they're in power. And that's when we show how different we are to just some sort of puppet agency which is supporting a political party of one form or the other. And I think that's basically the choice that we have in the situation, because we can't pretend to be neutral between dictatorship and democracy. That's just not an option, and unfortunately that means we're going to get this label from the political parties and forces which are against democracy. We just have to suck it up, and to some extent, unfortunately, and fight for what we believe in. So
EU association, how that plays into it?
Yeah, well, in terms of the EU, I was going to answer the EU question actually as well, in terms of the institutions. So obviously, as you said, a criticism of the EU institutions unites this kind of authoritarian axis, and it sort of brings together these autocrats. But I think there's something to be said for our sector not doing the opposite and saying we support the EU institutions and we think everything's great, because it's not. A lot of these lies that these authoritarian forces tell about us have that little scintilla of truth about them. And we have to be honest to ourselves about it, right? When they say there's a lot that's wrong with the EU, there's a lot of democratic deficit in some aspects of EU institutions, they're right, they're just right in the wrong ways. And I think this is another way in which we differentiate ourselves from the political parties and political forces themselves. I'm happy to see that Julie Ward has arrived, who's an old comrade. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm both Georgian and I'm British at the same time. So, and my British hat on, we were both fighting the referendum campaign against Brexit in 2016, which is in some ways a similar kind of battle to the ones that we're currently fighting in our region. And what happened then was a lot of us in that campaign said we were going to be in and against the EU. And what does that mean? We're fighting to be in these institutions, we're fighting for democracy, but we have a lot of criticism of those institutions, and we will tirelessly fight once we're inside to destroy the things we don't like about the EU, the anti-democratic elements, the overly opaque elements and the lacking transparency, and fight for those elements that we believe in. So I think that's a way, I think, in which civil society can thread the needle between becoming too political in some ways, but also keeping our integrity. I think that also very much applies on the EU level. Now, I also have to answer the question around Georgia, and will the election be rigged? How can it be rigged and how can we fight it? Well, if I knew the answer to that question, I would be going around all the political parties and electoral observation missions right now and spreading the secret. Unfortunately, I don't know. Do I think it could be rigged? I think rigged has many different definitions, obviously. So one way it almost definitely will be rigged is the misuse and abuse of administrative resources that every Georgian government has basically resorted to at some just varying degrees. So, unofficial pressure being put on, especially teachers actually, because they are quite well geographically spread. So, working as civil servants, to sort of pressure them to turn out to the polls, and sort of maybe they don't even have to be threatened openly. Maybe it's not like you will vote for us or you lose your job, but it's more like, yeah, I expect you to be at the polls. This sort of expectation that their jobs might well be under threat if the government changes, because you're one of us. Those people get in, you might lose your job, they'll bring their own people. So that kind of clientelist sort of system is a way in which definitely the government will seek to do that. That's for sure, I think. What's less sure is whether there will be outright fraud or outright shenanigans. I wouldn't rule it out, especially, they have electronic voting, but we have electronic voting in Venezuela, and Maduro just basically wrote his own results in the end and just ignored the electronic voting. So, you can rig an election if you're very determined, whatever the system is. But I think in Georgia that would be more difficult. So I think the reality is they might rely on the judiciary, as we've said. The judiciary in Georgia is even in the best times, actually, the judiciary is the weak point of Georgian institutional development. And I think it could be that they rely on the judiciary to cancel results that are not in their favour. They'll find violations in the opposition districts, but not in the government. There are lots of different ways in which they could steal the election. So it's a spectrum. So how do we fight it? I wish I knew. I'll tell you in 2 weeks' time. So I think I've spoken too long. But I'll hand over now.
Katarzyna to complete the circle.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will start with this own party of civil society, as I understood, if my Russian still works. So I think we will lose. If we have any, we will lose. The politics and civil society, these are completely different rules. We are about values. Adam Bodnar already has to support things that I think he does not, but he has to be effective. He has his, we say, director about Donald Tusk. So, and Donald Tusk is, which is our prime minister for those who don't know. And very strong personality, Adam Bodnar is not able to say, I'm not supporting that, which of course makes a lot of disappointment, causes a lot of disappointment on the civil society side, especially as regards migration. So I think we are about values, but what is important and is about winning anything is about narratives. I think that what we can do and because we are about society, politicians answer needs of the society. They do polls They know what is needed. They know what kind of narrative is addressing the citizens. So we need to change these narratives. So we need to change the society to be less prone to those narratives. As regards EU funding, EU in general, I think that thanks to Viktor Orban, the European Union changed itself. And I remember also, like 2016, I was here in Berlin on some meeting. I mentioned something about Kaczynski, which was our emperor, and they said, Kaczynski is nothing, Orban. And you just have smarter guy. Our guys were trying to repeat Orban in a different society, in different times. So they won elections because they were about patriotic values. 8 years later, patriotic values were not that important. Eight years later, we had the Netflix generation that knew about LGBT issues. They knew it from films. And they were different. Young generation just had different values, which was not observed by the politicians. So it's also about that. Sorry, I just wanted to say that EU helped us a lot. And we had very strong lobbying in the EU. And also about money, it was not easy for them to, at least not over the 8 years. We also used the EU law, because in the EU, we used, for example, we had, and it's also about narratives. They wanted to introduce different laws on the local level that were against LGBT rights. What civil society did, they named this LGBT-free zones. Of course, this sounded wrong even for the right. So they trying to explain, and they were in the position when they said, no, it's complicated. We were saying, no, it is LGBT-free zone. So we were using the populistic narrative. I mean civil society. And we kind of overtook the methods used by the populists, naming things that they wanted to do more subtle. So this is why I think we are about changing narratives, but we also managed with this kind of narratives to address European Union that said no money for the LGBT-free zones. And it was then discussion about values and money together. So I would say it helped us a lot, the EU, to protect EU funding.
Thank you very much. Well, how I wish this lessons learned, this analysis, this reflection is put on paper and maybe published. Where's the, well, we have leadership of the forum here, published as a collection, maybe in a sort of a single framework. These lessons are so important for not only for the continuing struggles in your countries, but also for many others. Bulgaria, Slovakia, and even more in the West, where the right wing or left wing extreme political forces are gaining momentum, and so on. Well, I invite you to join me in thanking and applauding our wonderful speakers.